Great, here we are with Ann Astell at the coffee shop at the Loyola University Library here along the lake. We have a beautiful view and have been enjoying talking about Maria. I've been filling Ann in a little bit about some of the mystical things that dear Dr. Montessori talked about and the way she talked about her own discoveries, if you will. But I'm very interested in to sort of pick your brain about mysticism because Maria was, either praised or accused for being a mystic, depending on which side of the coin you're on. But can you give us a little bit of insight about, how does someone earn the label of mystic? What makes someone a mystic?
Well, that's a very good question, right? um, in the past, people have thought of mystics as people who had like very extraordinary paranormal experiences, and so they belong to a very small sect
Yes.
of people, and but I think now the tendency has been to recover a much broader definition of mysticism, which is also more traditional. Um, so, so it would be, I would think a mystic is someone who has experienced some direct sense of the presence of God. And it can be more or less unveiled.
What does that mean?
So there's an example from the life of the founder of Large, John Vanier.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And, he was a very faithful Christian, very serious Christian. But he tells how after many years of practicing the Christian way of life as best he could, one day he stepped outside the door and it was a sunny day, and all of a sudden he felt the presence of God looking at him with great love. And it opened his soul in a different way to God, because he made a contact with God. It was like as if God had smiled at him.
Yeah.
And I think that would count as a mystical experience, is where all of a sudden life takes on a depth dimension.
Yes. It seems like that is a broad definition in a sense that, I can say I have had experiences of feeling God's presence, but it feels like a I don't know, a real mystic. I don't know. So, that experience sort of changes everything in a very dramatic way. So, would that be fair to say? Or?
Well, there are. When you think about one of the most famous mystics of modern time, although some people question whether she was a mystic, Saint Therese of the Little Flower, right?
Yeah.
And she was someone, who it seems as if her whole life was sort of lived in the presence of God,
Yes.
from childhood on, right? And so you can't say that there was a radical turning point, or this, but there certainly were different periods,
right?
But in times where she maybe didn't experience the presence of God, where he sort of withdrew from her,
right?
But she never lost contact with him. Somehow she knew he was there, but just kind of behind the cloud, right?
Right.
Or behind the veil.
Okay.
And so, so I would push back, against saying that the real mystics are only those, where there's been a radical, observable change in their life, because sometimes it doesn't work that way.
Right. Okay. I hear you. Okay. I like that. So there's a sense, so we're talking about somehow having an experience of God's presence.
Yes, that makes a difference.
That makes a difference somehow. Okay.
Yeah,
so,
it can be more gentle or more 180 degrees kind of difference.
Gotcha. So now you recently connected two of your interests, mysticism and mimetic theory in a wonderful paper looking at the career of Rene Girard, the developer of mimetic theory, from the point of view of the stages of a mystic's journey, or stages of the life of a mystic. And I was really intrigued by that because, I share your love of mimetic theory and have been devoted to understanding it and Rene's process of discovering it, if you will. So you used this, in your paper, where you talked about those three stages and then fit Rene in, or analyzed his career using those three stages. So if you could you start us with that first stage, because I think that's where, if there is going to be sort of a dramatic conversion experience, it can happen, that launches you on your mystical path, if you will, right?
Yes.
So can you talk about what that is and what happened with Rene?
Yeah. All right. Well, the three stages, as you remember from the talk, are purgative, illuminative, and unitive. Right?
Yes.
Okay, those are the three. And the first stage, the purgative, is usually connected with conversion.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so some kind of a turning point in one's life that is in a way sort of prompted by a certain presence of God experience, right?
Yeah.
There's some kind of an encounter that gives a person the desire to change, or to think differently, or there's some kind of a contact in that first stage. And so for Rene Girard, as he describes it, he started studying realistic fiction, right, and the novels, and went about it in a very deconstructive mode, very kind of cynical and skeptical, thinking about the effects of modern democracy on fiction writing.
Yeah.
And how, because of everyone's equal to everyone else, you start to actually competing with each other, but in the process of competing, and God being set aside and out of the picture, the person you're competing with becomes sort of your God, right?
Yes.
And so as he's studying these, he ends up thinking about God, right? And and about how there's a kind
even though he didn't want to.
Yeah, and about how there's a kind of an inversion of mysticism in the novels. And of course then he started to think about his own life, in a modern democracy, and who he might be imitating and all of this, and
right,
and who's he imitating while he's writing this particular literary study, right? And so he says that the very study of the mimetic is self-implicating and makes you think about, who are my models? Who am I imitating?
Right.
And am I imitating God, or am I imitating the devil? And does the devil sometimes look like God for me? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as he was thinking about this, he became interested in how novels end. Right?
Yes.
Okay. The conclusion of a novel, it's a different sort of moment than you have during the rest of the novel, right? Because usually the hero dies, right? And as they're dying, their whole life flashes in front of their eyes, right? And they see it from a different perspective, and they realize, all of the entanglements, and it's a purifying, moment,
right?
And as the person in the novel is dying, the author of the novel, kind of his perspective aligns with that of the character, and he also sees his work, his life work, kind of in that same line, and has to let it go, right?
Right.
And so Rene said, okay, well, this could be a moment of conversion,
right? Yes, he observed that the novelist was having a conversion experience as they were writing the novel. Is that right?
Yes.
So that forced him, and that was an insight of Rene's that he brought to literary criticism at the time. This was in the 60s, right?
Right.
In the
yeah.
1960s.
The Deceit, Desire, in the novel was
in
his
the
first big book.
60s. And how was that received? That book was created kind of a bit of a sensation, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't recall. There was one
You
kind
were
of
a baby
reaction,
then,
one
honey.
kind of reaction on the American side,
That's
another
right.
kind of reaction on the French side. There was a famous French Marxist critic, who was very impressed with the book because of its sociological analysis. And I think the American critics were sort of taken aback because it wasn't sort of the formal kind of analysis, a close reading. Instead, it was reading the fictions as a kind of an evidence,
Yes.
a mirror of our society. And that was very new at the time.
Yes, it was. Yes, and for him, for Rene, his work, as you say, studying beginning to question who he was and who he was imitating and trying to be like. We all have mentors and models, and especially in academia, you're all, that who's ever the lead in your field, you're trying to outdo them and whatever. So he became, in a way, as you say, self-implicated in his study of this sort of mechanism.
Yes.
And it involved him in questioning in some spiritual questions.
Yes.
Because I think in his reading of Dostoevsky, isn't it from Dostoevsky where he says, when God is dead, we become gods for one another, or something? I'm paraphrasing it.
Yeah.
But he was forced to engage with these issues of God, and I just so what is that experience like? Because I think that a lot of times this initial phase, we all can maybe feel a little pull in that direction, but to go all the way, as you say, it requires a bit of your heart breaking open and a little bit of questioning everything you've been doing up to now. So there's a sense of discovering things you would rather not know about yourself, I guess. Is that's part of this phase?
Rene says the great novelists write every novel twice. And the first time you write it, you get all the way to the end. It's like your first draft, and it's bad.
Yeah.
And you look and you think that's bad. But the insight, this is bad, enables you to go back and write it. The second draft, which turns out differently.
Right.
Because you realize, okay, I don't want to end up where I ended up here.
Right.
And so and that's where the originality comes out. There's a breakthrough, in the artwork, the great artists, and so when Rene discovered this, that the endings of novels are actually very important, and that they take on the pattern of Christian imagery of death and rebirth, resurrection.
Yeah.
Then he said somehow the story of Christ, the story of the gospel, is the story. It's the story. Whether you're Christian or not.
Right.
That's how the novel has to end, because the great writer has had this new birth, right? And there's no other story that tells that story.
That's so interesting, because I, at one time fancied myself a fiction writer, and I took a lot of classes in it and everything. And the process of writing is writing through the bad stuff into some sort of discovery, and it's painful, and there's a lot of throwing things away and erasing. And I have to say, I had one or two moments in those years where I was trying to be a writer, where I got through to a deep enough place that I had a bit of a transcendent experience. I kind of just walked away and I walked away from the desk, you know, and felt this expansiveness
Yes.
where life was just bigger.
Yes.
I was bigger somehow. And yeah, so that makes sense to me that Rene would discover that in the great writers and that he would
And it was just when
impact him.
And it was just when he was writing his first big book, his first
That's
really
right.
great book,
That's
yeah,
right. Yeah.
and laying out his original mimetic theory, and it was a source of great joy for him and expansion, right? And
Right.
so you would see that there was a kind of I would say a sort of veiled presence of God's love. He describes it as just a beautiful feeling, you know, that all of a sudden he knew something he didn't know before,
Didn't know, yeah.
and you know, just reading the novel on the train, and the world looked so beautiful. The sun was setting,
Right.
and just very pleasant, and just enjoying it, right?
Yes.
And he said there was no particular call for a change of life. He was just enjoying understanding something he hadn't before, and feeling free, you know, to write a book that no one had ever written before.
Yeah.
And then there was a next step, right? Yeah.
Yes, and I was going to ask you about that. That there was a moment of crisis for him. That was a health problem, and I think it, you know, it somehow crystallized things for him in a way that I guess it made it urgent.
Yes.
In a way.
Yeah.
It's the way he describes it anyway.
You know, that for the process to be complete, there had to be some kind of change of life, as he says. Right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, he was around the same time that he was having these beautiful experiences, reading the novels, and, you know, having his new insight. He was diagnosed with a kind of skin cancer.
Right.
And he didn't know how serious it was, how treatable it was. You know, obviously went to a doctor's care. And then they entered the liturgical season of Lent, and then finally he got the good news, the good news that, you know, he was cured on Wednesday during Holy Week, and then he was just out of gratitude and joy, because he had been praying about this.
Yes.
He went to confession, he received the Eucharist, he went through the whole liturgical experience of death and life, you know, in the Paschal mystery, and then began to live as a practicing Catholic, he and his whole family.
Yeah, the whole family. Oh, security breach. But yeah, his wife, Martha, came. Was she religious or Catholic before that?
Well, I mean, Irish Catholic family, right?
She was, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think they'd been practicing,
No,
either
but
of
it
them.
made sense to her.
Yeah, it did make sense.
Yeah.
Kind of coming home in a way.
It's just a beautiful thing. I mean, it's interesting because for Montessori, her faith was always sort of a big part of her life, but I'm not sure it was the animating force early in her life. She was very also caught up in academic success and trying to achieve things that hadn't been achieved before as a woman and so forth. So there's parallels there that I'm going to explore more deeply. Yes.
No, I really want to encourage you, Suzanne, because I think there's, for the little you've told me, I mean, I'm perfectly ready to believe that Maria Montessori was a mystic, right? And that grace, sometimes grace is planted just as a seed, and it grows in your life, right? And you can then see, if you study a life as a whole, the different moments, when there's kind of like growth spurts, in this inner life, as it expresses itself outward.
Well, I think that's what I really like about what you're doing with this framework, because I think for someone like Girard and Montessori, whose lives, their faith was so central, that to understand the whole arc of their life, you have to understand their faith journey as well.
Yes.
And Maria's biographers haven't really focused on that. They focused on her spirituality as just sort of a given, but not as a sort of a dynamic process that was part of her discovery. And that's sort of what I want to do when I tell her story, because I just think her spirit, it's how she connected with the spirit of the child, you know. But anyway, I'm going to pause us here for a minute and thank you for that wonderful introduction to mysticism, and maybe come back and have another conversation.
Pleasure.
Thank you, dear. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne.